Model Making Guru is sponsored by emodels.co.uk, your one-stop shop for all your model making needs. emodels.co.uk. Make something awesome. Hey everyone, it's Foxx from Model Making Guru here. Hello, and welcome to a very short video showing you how to make your own wet palette for almost no money whatsoever. Now, I know most of you out there are thinking, what the hell is a wet palette? Well, if you use water-based acrylic paints, a wet palette is going to help your brush painting a billionfold. It's something I've just kind of stumbled across. I've just found out about when I started doing the Tau Piranha, and I started my brush painting with the Citadel paints. And I'm like, okay, this is fine. But then I read about this wet palette and I'm like, this sounds interesting. I need to find out how to do this. Now, this applies only for people really if you're using water-based acrylic paints. Wet palettes have no use at all for lacquer paints, oil paints, enamel paints. This is just for water-based paints. So, for example, paints like Ammo by MIG water-based paints. Vallejo paints, so the Vallejo Air range, which might not need to thin, but Vallejo Air range, Vallejo standard colours, Vallejo game colours, those kind of paints, Citadel paints, and many others, P3 paints, I think there are a load of others anyway, any water-based paints. Tamiya paints are not included because Tamiya paints are not water-based, they're alcohol-based, they're more like lacquers, so this does not apply for them. This is no use for it at all, and to be honest, I wouldn't even bother brushing the Tamiya paints anyway, it's just complete ass. Now, traditionally, if you're like 99.9% of model makers, me included, when you do your paint mixing and paint dishing out onto models, you use a palette like this, a standard dry palette, like a piece of plastic lid or a dish or an actual palette. That's just a piece of plastic or tile or whatever that you put your paint on and you pick it up and you mix it around. It's brilliant, but there are disadvantages. If I mix a perfect shade, let's say I spent getting this perfect shade here, I spent an hour doing that, and I've got brilliant, and then I have to go to the loo, or I go downstairs to make a cup of coffee, or I finish for the night and I come back the next day, that's rock hard. I have to then remix that paint and try and figure out how the hell did I get that colour, or if I use it all up and I need to mix more, it's a real pain. Plus it dries out, most acrylic paints dry out quite fast. And you know, you'll put a load of paint on there, you'll work them for a bit, you'll put it on the model, and after 5 or 10 minutes it's all kind of too dry and you're having to put more thinner in it, which affects the way the paint works and adheres to the surface and the depth of the colour, and it's just a nightmare. You end up using a lot more paint than you need to. This, ow, you don't need that anymore. Forget it. It's fine if you're just doing base colours and things like that, if you just want to get paint on a model and you're not worried about it. But if you're doing anything that involves mixing, working for a long time, if you want to do some blending of colours, or if you just want your paint to stay wet and usable for a lot longer without having to use tons of paint, so it saves you using a load of paint, get yourself a wet palette. Now, you can go out and buy wet palettes. They range from anywhere from £10 to £20 to £25. Don't bother. Don't buy a wet palette. They often come with a bit of sponge or some refillable spongy paper. You don't need to spend that kind of money. All you need is a sealable container of some sort. This is an airtight sandwich container I got from Tesco. It's a few quid, 2 or 3 quid. But any kind of sealable container will do. You can make them yourself out of, if you get blister packs with your miniatures in, or the ammo paints come in those little blister packs, they'll be fine. They're not quite airtight, but they'll be all right. But if you can get an airtight sandwich container for a few quid, perfect. You'll need some normal kitchen roll. I prefer kitchen roll because it's more spongy. I have got a roll of what I got from Aldi, a big massive roll of tissue called clean-up tissue for like workshops. It's not quite porous enough. Stick to normal household kitchen towel. The more absorbent the better. You will need some scissors, and you will need some of this. This is parchment paper. Now, if you're in the US, you can go to any supermarket, any mall, supermarket store, and they'll have parchment paper. It's usually around the kitchen foil and greaseproof paper area. It may be in the home baking section. If you're in the UK, yeah, it's a bit of a ball ache to try and find some. I went to like Tesco's, Aldi, Sainsbury's. I went to a load of my local supermarkets and they had foil, they had greaseproof paper, they had what was called a combination of this and tinfoil, which is no use. I had to get this online on Amazon. It was like 3 quid. But if you can check out your local supermarkets, you will find it. Now, you don't want to get greaseproof paper. You don't want to use tin foil. It has to be parchment. The one I've used is Mason Cash Cake Decoration Non-Stick Mini Baking Parchment. It needs to say parchment on it. If it says greaseproof or waxed, you don't want that. And I'll explain that in a bit. So what do? Dead simple. First of all, you try and get the lid off this. There we go. There's our little container. Now what you do is you get yourself some kitchen roll. I've folded this over. It's 4 sheets folded over to make a nice thick pad. I've cut it to the right shape and size to fit in the bottom. Now you can use sponge for this. If you get like the sponge that comes in miniatures or anything like that, or packing foam, that probably work. I find sponge is a bit more labour intensive. You have to eventually have to clean it out, whereas it's kitchen roll, once this starts getting minky and horrible, you just throw it away and make some more. So kitchen roll, you will need the waters. I have some waters here, and all I'm going to do is do it with my other hand so you can see it. Take this tray, I'm going to pour the water in, dead straightforward, and I'm going to pour it in till it's just above the level of the tissue. There we go. So you can see there now, tissue is underwater, it is submerged. Ted's with his submarine off the side waiting to go dive, spello. So that's that. Now I'm going to leave that for a second, and all you do, now you've done that, what I want to do is get rid of most of the excess of that water, because I don't want this to be like an ocean. I want the tissue to be damp. So just hold the tissue in place with your thumb, because it's going to move everywhere. Just pull the excess away. There, that's fine. So now I have some really damp tissue. Take your parchment paper. Now this is, unfortunately, I bought this roll thinking it was a big one. It's not, it's a little tiny one, but it doesn't really matter. If you can get a piece where you can cut a size exactly to this size, that's brilliant. But if not, don't worry. Get yourself some parchment paper. Take off a random amount. Look at me doing arts and crafts. I know, me doing arts and crafts on the telly and everything. And all you do is you plop this down. Do it, it's going to naturally fold, so try and do it the other way, just so it doesn't book back on itself. Just place this down onto the tissue and press it in. Make sure it's pressed flush against the tissue. Some water will bubble up, and that's fine. What you're wanting to do is make sure this is pressed right against the tissue with no air bubbles, so that everything gets thoroughly sodden. And as I say, I'll explain why you want parchment in a little bit. So make sure this is all thoroughly sodden, and I'll explain why, you know, the advantages of a wet palette and stuff. So that's all squidged through. So once it's gone damp on the top and you can feel it, just turn it over, if you can pick it up without ripping the tissue, and just do the other side as well, just to make sure it's wet on both sides. Make sure it's flat, not wrinkly and crinkly. You want it to be pressed flat. Okay, now sometimes if you do this with a big piece, the piece might curl up as it goes in the water. That's fine, just fight with it to get it completely flat. And once it stops fighting you back, turn it over and flatten it again. If you're using a piece of sponge, it sometimes helps to get, if you can cut a piece big enough for here of the sponge, then make sure you cut a piece of the parchment paper. Unless you get a tiny little roll like me, if you get a big roll of, like, you know, kitchen foil size roll of parchment paper, just cut a piece that's slightly bigger so you can fold it under the sponge, and you have now made a wet palette. What do you do with a wet palette? Dead easy. What you do is you take your paint and you drop it on like that. Now what will basically happen is that all the water that's in that tissue is there, and it's sat underneath this parchment paper. Now the parchment paper is not waterproof, but it's not fully allowing the water through either. It just kind of wicks a little bit through, and the paint in here uses the water to stay hydrated. When the paint's on here, it will very slowly suck up little bits of water and kind of maintain its water content. So what you should find is, rather than this drying out in 5 minutes on a plastic or wooden or ceramic palette, a dry palette, this will actually stay wet and workable. It may dry out a little bit. It means you can keep, if you're going to be painting, say, something for a long time, you're going to be 3 or 4 hours painting one colour, you can just keep dipping into that, dipping into that. If you need to add a little bit of water to your brush just to flush it a little bit, you can do. It's always a good practice when you're painting to get a little tot of water on your brush first before you put it in the paint, just to make sure everything's hydrated. But it will keep this paint wet and moist and workable. If you have two colours, let's do a random one. If you have two colours, I chose white on a white background, you're an idiot, Fox. And let's say you want to do some mixy, I'll just choose a shitty brush that I don't worry about. If I want to mix, say, a custom colour, I might just drag some of this white paint along here, and I might drag some of that brown paint along. And that'll give me a wonderful mid-tone here that I can move around. And if I'm, say, painting something that's got a low light, or sorry, a low tone, a high tone, and a mid-tone, so it's got brown shadows, not really going to have this, but brown shadows, white highlights, and a medium mix of brown and white for the mid-tone, I've now got three colours on my palette, and these are going to stay workable, so I can work on the low tones, then do a bit of high tone, then do some of the mid-tones, and then I can go back to the other colours, and these will all stay workable for much longer. I won't have to worry about this mid-tone drying out and having to try and mix the same colour again. So these are absolutely brilliant. They're no use, like I say, for Tamiya paints. They're no use at all for oil paints or enamel paints because they don't use water, but they are perfect for water-based paints, and it's just a way to keep your paint workable for longer and to stop it going dry. Because if you notice, when you brush paint water-based paints, when they go a little bit dry and start to dry out on the palette, they become lumpy and clumpy, and they can become harder to work with, especially if you're doing fine detail. So this just means your paint stays hydrated. Now the beauty of this is you can work on it for ages, although obviously if you're sat under hot lights or if you're in a really hot climate, it may still dry out on the wet palette because the water will dry out. Let's say it comes to the end of the day and I finish my painting, but I know tomorrow I want to use some of that mid-tone brown. I'm thinking I need to use that again tomorrow, but I'm never going to mix that colour again, not a problem. Put the lid back on. That's now airtight. Put this in the fridge. Leave it in the fridge overnight. When you come back in the morning, take the lid off. It'll be cold, but that paint will still be workable. Now it can dry out a little bit, and it will do if I dry out eventually. It's not going to make it last forever. It just keeps it soluble. If it does dry out a little bit, you can just add a touch more water in there just to mix it a little bit. Other options are, if you want to, you can add, if you're familiar with using paint retarders and flow aids, you can always mix some of that into the water. It will seep through and it'll enhance the paint even more. I've not done that because I haven't got any, but you can. Some people do that. You can that wet palette with the lid on in the fridge could last me for days and days and days. It could last me for, theoretically, it can last you for weeks. Eventually, it will dry out completely. But when you're finished, if you've either used up all your palette paper or you think the tissue's past its usable life, dead simple. Just pick it up. Squeeze out the excess water into a container so you're not throwing that in the bin. And throw it away. Give this a rinse. Done. Put some more tissue down, some more parchment paper, and you've got a brand new palette. And that's it. That's how to make a wet palette. Now, you will find it takes a little getting used to. You may have to fiddle around with the parchment paper to make sure you get the right one. Some parchment papers are a bit worse than others, but why do you want parchment paper and not greaseproof or waxproof paper, anything like that? Well, greaseproof paper is waterproof. It's not going to let the water seep up through the paper into the paint. Some people have said that they've used greaseproof baking paper and boiled it to get the wax or the greaseproofing off. And you can get waxed paper as well, the same thing. It won't really work, but you can boil it a little bit to get some of that coating off. It does work a bit, but it's not brilliant. Just see if you can get yourself some parchment. Like I say, in the US, you'll find it in any store with the baking goods or the tin foil and stuff. In the UK, you might have to hunt around or go on Amazon. Say, this little roll here cost me about £3, and it was free shipping because I'm an Amazon Prime member. But you can get big, long, 2 foot long rolls the size of tin foil rolls. But that's it. That's why you would use it. The parchment paper just helps that water go through. It doesn't suck it completely. Now, it's important, obviously, that you don't have water flowing around, because if you have water flowing everywhere, your paint's just going to disappear into the water, and that's rubbish. So just make sure when you've filled it above the tissue, you just tip out the excess so the tissue is sodden, but not water everywhere. As I say, you can use sponge, and what some people like to do is fill it to just almost the top of the level of sponge and then put the parchment paper on the sponge. But of course, then you've got to be careful when you move it around that you don't slop it everywhere. So just fill it to the top of the sponge, let it soak into the sponge, drain off any excess, and there you go. If you're using a sponge, then you have to occasionally clean it because it will get manky. It's damp in there and things are going to start growing. You're going to get creatures in there. So you have to wash the sponge out occasionally. You know, dish soap or anything else will do that, or some people wash them out in vinegar. You can, as I say, you can buy wet pallets, and some come with just a special piece of thick sort of foamy paper that's the sponge or the tissue equivalent. And you get maybe 2 or 3 of those in the kit, and you'll get 5 or 6 sheets of this, and then you have to buy refills. I wouldn't bother. You can use blotting paper. That's basically what's in the bottom of the paint pallets, the pre-made ones. And the paper they use is cheaper. So don't necessarily go out and buy one, although you can do. There's nothing stopping you. But do have a think about using a wet palette. If you do a lot of brush painting, or even if you don't do much, I mean, this takes me 5 minutes to make it, and it costs me £pounds. So if you're going to be doing some brush painting, give this a try. It's no use if you're doing, say, if you're using one of these big ass brushes to base coat a model like this, where you're not thinning the paint. You don't need to worry about that, although it might help you, waste less paint. It will help you use less paint for everything else, detail painting, doing blends and things. It won't work if you're doing glazes, because glazes, you want to use a normal palette for that, because that's where you're dealing with very, very, very thin down paints in a medium, or that kind of thing. So that's not really going to work on here because you don't need that there. This if you're just mixing basic paints. And for some paints, the ammo ones are quite good. I've not tried Citadel, doesn't really work for, but for some paints, just having them on the wet palette dilutes them enough to paint them straight on. Like normally you have to add a little bit of water to then brush paint on it. You have to thin them a little bit. As Duncan says, thin your paints. With some like these, you might find some of the colours, actually that's enough, that's all you need. But as a matter of course, wet your brush before you pick up any paint. And one last tip, it doesn't work for metallics. Metallics work in a whole different way. They have metal flakes suspended, or flakes of some sort suspended in them, so that doesn't really work. One last thing, after a little while, depending on the paint, you may come back to your palette and see that the paint is separated out into its constituent parts like pigment, medium and other things. That's fine, that happens anyway, that's natural. Just mix them back together with a cocktail stick or something, just scribble them back together and you'll get the colour back in. Again, if you keep thinning them too much with water on top, you will eventually affect how they work and they won't be as good, so try to avoid that. And that's it. So go and get yourself some basic equipment, go and make a wet palette, and trust me, you'll find that your brushing becomes so much better, because first and foremost, you're not rushing for time for the paint to dry out your palette. You're spending less on paint because you're not using as much paint. You can use half a tub of paint. These things dry out like in minutes, so you can use half a tub of this to paint that, because by the time you've painted this, all this paint's dried out. So you'll use less paint, and it just gets you into a place where you're not having to worry about the palette at all. You can just do it and mix it, and you think, I need to come back to it tomorrow. Brilliant. Put a lid on, stick it in the fridge, come back tomorrow, carry on where you left off. Absolutely vital if you're working with custom blends of paint, because you're never going to mix the same colour twice. But that's it. So go off and make yourself one. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say, really. Just wanted to show you this. So thanks very much for watching. Go make one of these. Go do something cool. Go brush paint something awesome. I'm going to use this a lot now. I'm doing the Citadel stuff. But yeah, go off and make one of these. Have yourself a great time. Have yourself a great time. Any questions? Drop a comment on the video. And until next time, adios amoebas.